You know, sometimes the best way to really understand global dynamics is to ask a big what if.
A significant hypothetical.
Yeah, exactly. And today, that's what we're doing. We're diving into what might happen if U.S. support for Ukraine, well, if it was significantly reduced or maybe even stopped altogether.
It's a scenario with potentially huge ripple effects.
Right. We've looked at a range of expert analyses on this, trying to map out the potential consequences.
The chain reactions, essentially.
Yeah.
Oh.
So our mission here is to unpack that the immediate fallout in Ukraine, the bigger geopolitical shifts, the tough questions it raises, basically a shortcut for you to get up to speed on this really critical hypothetical.
Okay, where do we start? The impact inside Ukraine seems like the most immediate place.
Definitely. Let's start right there.
Well, the first thing that jumps out is how interconnected everything is for Ukraine. The U.S. aid hasn't just been one thing, has it?
No, it's been weapons, intelligence, financial support, pretty comprehensive.
Exactly. So if you pull back significantly on that, the military impact on the ground could be,
Yeah.
well, very fast and very severe.
You mean like running out of ammunition, things like that?
Yeah, dwindling ammunition stockpiles,
Mhm.
weaker air defenses are a huge one, and maybe losing access to some critical real-time intelligence.
And that translates directly to the battlefield, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. You could see a pretty rapid shift. Russia might not just consolidate where they are, but potentially make significant new gains.
So actual territorial losses for Ukraine become a real possibility.
A stark one, yes. And this military side doesn't happen in a vacuum,
Right? There's the human cost.
precisely. Less financial aid hits essential services hard. Think food, shelter, medical care. These could be severely disrupted.
Like we've seen in other places where aid gets cut suddenly, food distribution networks failing.
Exactly. Widespread hunger, shortages of essential medicines.
Yeah.
The humanitarian crisis, already terrible, could get much worse.
And that potentially triggers more displacement,
Yeah.
more refugees.
It certainly could, yeah. Intensifying the pressure on neighboring countries that are already stretched is a devastating ripple effect.
And the psychological side for Ukrainians.
That's huge, too. Feeling abandoned by a key ally like the U.S., it could lead to a really profound sense of vulnerability, maybe even despair, on top of everything else they've endured.
Okay, so let's shift focus. How might Russia react to this? To a U.S. pullback?
Well, it seems almost certain the Kremlin would frame it as a major victory, a validation, perhaps, of their strategy.
And does that embolden them? Could they actually decide to push further, expand their goals?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? A perceived win, a sense that Western resolve is cracking, could certainly tempt Moscow to pursue more ambitious aims.
Like what? Going beyond their initially stated objectives.
Potentially, yes. Maybe aiming for complete control or annexing even more territory. If they sense the U.S. commitment is wavering long-term, they might see a window of opportunity. Less risk of major pushback, perhaps.
And internationally, does the pressure on Russia ease?
It likely would. Less scrutiny, perhaps a greater sense of impunity on the world stage?
Which has implications way beyond Ukraine for all of Eastern Europe.
Absolutely. A more aggressive, less constrained Russia fundamentally changes the security picture for everyone in the region. More instability, more danger.
Okay, so that brings us to NATO and the European allies. How does this hypothetical play out there?
This could really test the alliance's unity, couldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. is the cornerstone of NATO. If Washington seems to waver on supporting a partner facing aggression, what does that say about Article 5?
That is the absolute core concern. Doubts could creep in among European allies about the reliability of those U.S. security guarantees. Article 5, the attack on one is an attack on all principle. It relies on unwavering commitment.
So if the commitment looks shaky outside NATO, allies might worry about inside NATO, too.
It's a plausible fear, and that uncertainty, well, could lead to a fracturing of unity. Maybe you see individual countries pursuing more independent, divergent security policies.
Which could weaken the collective defense overall.
Potentially, yes. And the signal this sends isn't just to allies.
You mean to other authoritarian actors?
Exactly. If the U.S. appears less willing to stand firm against aggression, other regimes might see it as a green light, or at least a yellow one, to pursue their own agendas more forcefully.
They might think there's less risk, more opportunity.
Precisely. It could inadvertently encourage aggressive behavior elsewhere, leading to, wider global instability.
So connecting this to the bigger global picture, are we talking about accelerating that shift towards a more multipolar world?
It certainly feels like it could push things in that direction. If the U.S. steps back from a leading role, a vacuum is created.
And others might step in to fill it, like China, for instance.
Nations like China could indeed see their influence grow on the world stage. A multipolar order isn't inherently bad, but the transition could be turbulent.
And fundamentally, this kind of scenario, it challenges basic international rules, doesn't it?
It really does. Things like sovereignty, territorial integrity. If a major power seems to abandon a country facing clear aggression, it sets a really dangerous precedent for how future conflicts might be handled or mishandled.
Okay, let's pivot to the economics. You could argue, maybe, that reducing aid saves U.S. money in the short term.
You can make that argument, sure. Short-term fiscal relief.
But what about the longer-term global economic picture?
That's where it gets complicated. The potential for long-term global instability could easily outweigh those short-term savings.
How so?
Well, a prolonged or escalating conflict in Ukraine, worsened by less support, plus all the geopolitical uncertainty that disrupts global supply chains. Think energy, food, crucial components like microchips.
So higher prices, slower growth globally.
That's a significant risk, yes,
Yeah.
hindering global economic recovery.
And then there's the rebuilding of Ukraine itself whenever the conflict ends. That's a massive task.
Immense. And it becomes much, much harder without strong U.S. leadership and, frankly, significant financial commitment.
So the reconstruction could be delayed, less effective.
Absolutely. Coordinating that kind of international effort is tough. Without the U.S. playing a central role, the process could falter. And the economic burden might fall more heavily on Europe.
Potentially straining their economies too?
Yes, impacting their budgets, maybe even social cohesion if the costs are very high.
Okay. We've talked a lot about consequences, but we should also touch on Ukraine's own resilience, right? And alternative scenarios.
Definitely. It's crucial not to underestimate Ukrainian ingenuity and determination. They wouldn't just stop.
So what might they do? Seek more help elsewhere?
Intensify efforts with other allies? Absolutely. Look for more support from Europe, from other partners. They'd likely also double down on building up their own domestic defense industry.
We've seen some innovation there already, haven't we? With drones and things.
Remarkable adaptation, yes. They might accelerate that, focusing on asymmetric warfare, clever tech solutions, but scaling that up to replace major U.S. systems, that's a huge challenge.
And further mobilization, relying more on international law.
Further population mobilization, yes. Sustain national resistance. And using international legal and diplomatic channels, although their effectiveness without strong power backing can be, well, limited.
So resilience is key, but the scale of U.S. support. It's hard to overstate how difficult it would be to fill that gap.
Extremely difficult. Replacing that comprehensive package, military, intel, financial, would be an enormous, perhaps insurmountable task for Ukraine on its own, or even with other allies stepping up partially.
Okay, finally, let's bring it home. How might this play out within the United States? Public opinion, politics.
Oh, you'd expect a really intense domestic debate. Highly divisive.
Arguments on both sides, I assume.
For sure. Those supporting continued aid would stress, upholding international norms, supporting democracy, the strategic need to counter Russia.
All those wanting reduced involvement.
They'd likely point to domestic needs, economic concerns, arguments about overextension, the idea that resources should be focused at home.
And this could really impact future U.S. foreign policy direction, maybe even elections.
It absolutely could. A major shift like this could signal or even accelerate a broader move towards a more isolationist stance in U.S. foreign policy. It would have long-term repercussions for America's role in the world.
Wow. Okay. So wrapping this deep dive up, it's clear this hypothetical, a significant U.S. pullback from supporting Ukraine isn't simple at all.
Not even close. The consequences are deeply interconnected.
Yeah, from the immediate crisis in Ukraine, militarily and humanitarianly, to these bigger shifts in geopolitics, NATO's future, the global economy, and those tough ethical questions, too.
It really highlights the complexity and the far-reaching nature of such a potential decision.
So for you, our listener, trying to get a handle on these big global issues, hopefully exploring this hypothetical provides a useful framework. It helps understand the forces shaping our world right now.
And maybe it leaves you with a final thought. Considering all these potential cascading effects we've discussed across all these different areas, what single element do you think ultimately holds the most sway in determining where this conflict and maybe the broader international order goes next?